So I grew up in the 90s with my parents always telling me that buying a home is the best investment, only to find out later in life that that isn't really true. And now that I'm in my 30s, a lot of the people around my age, my friends, are all settling down and buying a home because that's the right thing to do, is what we might all be thinking. But the thing is, we never really asked the question where that belief came from. We never really took the time to unpack it. Real estate never loses value. Real estate never loses money. And paying rent is just throwing money away into a dumpster fire. That's the belief that we were taught with by our parents, especially if your parents are Asian. But here's the catch. That belief might have been true when mortgage rates were 3%, when we were living in a time of peace. But that's not the case right now. I think right now we're living in a time where there are many civil wars all across the country, in the US at least, because we have National Guards deployed in many Democratic states like Chicago, Memphis, California. And it really begs the question that if you have a little mini civil war happening in your neighborhood, how much can your house actually go for? But let's put a pin on that because we're gonna step back into reality, dial it back, and talk some numbers. At a 3% mortgage rate, a $700,000 house would cost you around $2,300 a month. But if that jumps to 7%, that same house is costing you somewhere around $3,800 a month. That's a huge difference. And when that happens, fewer people can afford to buy. And when fewer people can afford to buy, what you'll have is you'll just have supply stay the same or the supply of houses going up higher. And when that happens, that means that prices will drop. You know, a house that sold for $700K 2 years ago might now just be $580K, while the owner of it might have still have a mortgage of $680,000. So they're at a loss. So I had this friend in this exact position, but to make it worse, it's his second home. So he moved into the second home because he wanted more room, because his first condo was really, really small. And right now he's trying to get rid of that condo, but the market is so bad that he can't get his first place sold for a good price. And then you might ask, well, why don't he just rent it out? Well, the problem is he has a lot of pride, and he's thinking if someone wanted to buy his house, he'll have to kick out the tenants. And in BC, they have some really strict laws with regard to that, so it's not easily done. So he's just sitting on that house, having to pay the mortgage for that first house, but not living in it. And he's exactly at that point where if he sells the house right now, he'd either break even or he'd lose money. But he doesn't want to sell unless he makes a profit, because that's what our parents pushed onto us. Real estate only makes money. You only make a profit with real estate. Luckily for him, he's a software engineer, so he works a tech job, and the money he's making right now can cover both mortgages with barely anything left over for him to do anything else. So that's the definition of house poor, where all your money goes into paying off the mortgage for your homes. But if he gets canned or laid off in any manner with our terrible tech market right now, then in effect, he's screwed. What kind of things do you consider when you're buying a home? Probably the amenities, the space, the neighborhood, what kind of restaurants, cafes, or bars are nearby. But do you ever think about the job market or the economy? The answer is probably never. And while we're talking about amenities, I've made this nice little website, Trip Heat Map, that shows you the vibrancy index of a specific neighborhood that you might be looking to buy into or you might be looking to visit. So if you're doing some traveling and you want to know whether the neighborhood you're gonna be living in has nice restaurants or cafes or bars for you to check out, then check out tripheatmap.com. So let's face it, the average Joe is terrible with money. Like, did you know that the total consumer debt of the USA, which is basically all the personal debt of every single American in the country, sums up at $18.4 trillion. That's with a T, guys. So the average American has no idea about budgets, savings, or investments, let alone job markets and economies, which is much more complicated than basic finances that we should have been taught in high school. But if you're considering moving to anywhere, then let me make this simple for you. Go where the jobs are. A lot of companies right now are leaving places like New York and California for places like Texas. And knowing that, where do you think is a good neighborhood to buy in? New York, Los Angeles, Texas? It's gonna be Texas, of course, because that's where all the jobs are moving to. I mean, Los Angeles themselves don't even have money to put out wildfires during wildfire season. Yet, your average Joe continues to live in places like California or New York simply because they want to brag that they live in California, that they live in New York. So turning back to the story about my buddy with 2 homes. I met him when we were in college, when we were in university. That's what we call it up north in Canada. And we took 2 different roads. He continued to stay in Canada after graduating, whereas I left. I didn't see any opportunity there. When I graduated and I started doing interviews to find jobs locally in Vancouver, I was getting taken advantage of, plain and simple. Literally, there was this one interview that I remember to this day where the interviewer was telling me that they have this great view of the mountains and that this was worth a $10,000 price tag. And then I looked at the job offer that he gave me and I was wondering, oh, so that's why you're paying me that much. It was such bullshit. And anyways, Vancouver's industry is literally tourism, film, and television. It's much cheaper for American companies to always go up to Vancouver to film because they can always take advantage of the currency conversion. But like I said before, my buddy is in tech, I'm in tech, and if you haven't noticed, tech is going through some wild time with the intro of AI, and there's been layoffs left and right and center all across the world. As a result, what we have is we have a smaller supply of tech jobs, yet we still have a rising demand of tech jobs because we have software engineers graduating from universities and colleges every single semester, every single year, and they are looking for jobs. Therefore, if you've just graduated and you're looking for a job and you aren't able to find any job right now, then most likely the best thing to do is to move because you're gonna find opportunity elsewhere. But if you are a sucker and you bought into a house, you're locked down by the house and you can't move, then you have to keep that job because the chances are you likely wouldn't have bought the house unless you had the job. But if by any chance the job lays you off, then it's gonna be a very tough situation because the job market for tech workers is abysmal. And if you get fired or laid off and you can't find another job, then how the heck are you gonna pay for that mortgage? You know, a lot of people like to say renting is just throwing money away. And then I like to say, okay, then what do you think about maintenance costs? My parents were lucky because we had a lot of friends that were carpenters or construction workers. And every single time we had some issue, we just called them for help. And for the price of dinner, they'd end up helping fix the issue. And aside from that, my dad is actually a pretty good handyman, much handier than I am. So whenever there were problems that he could fix, then he'd just go ahead and fix them. However, most people don't have that network. They don't have that handiness, especially if you're a millennial or a Gen Z. What they have is a YouTube tutorial, a Home Depot card, and blind optimism. So when I first moved to the USA, for the first 4 years, I was living in Birmingham, and I just rented out just this one room from this guy, and it was $500 a month. It was super cheap. I loved it. I loved the rent because $500, everything was included. That means I was just paying $6K a year for a place to live. You can't beat that. There was one winter that I remembered, the water boiler died and everybody was complaining because how can you not have hot water when it's winter? Our landlord went ahead and replaced it. And you know, replacing a water boiler costs somewhere around $700 to $2,600. And that's not including the time that you're going to spend, you know, ripping out the broken water boiler and installing the new one. But luckily, the landlord that I had back then, he was very handy, so he did that all himself. He was always around the house doing maintenance work. I mean, just imagine the amount of time that can go towards something else that was spent on maintenance work. Now imagine that it wasn't a water boiler. Let's imagine that maybe it was the roof. Replacing a roof is much more expensive than a water boiler. It costs somewhere around $5,000 to $10,000. Suddenly that rent money that everybody would brag about would disappear just with one repair. I think that what most people tend to forget is that when you own, every single problem is your problem. There's not going to be a landlord. There's not going to be a backup plan. There's just going to be a bill with your name on it. You know, people like to argue. People like to argue that they are building equity. Yet, here's the twist. The renter that is calling their landlord to fix a broken issue is the real one that's building equity because they're the ones who are saving in peace. Meanwhile, the homeowner's equity is being eaten away by termites, leaks, and labor invoices. That's why I'm fine with renting for life. For now anyways, as long as I don't have a family. Because whenever there's a problem, I just call up my landlord and have him fix the problem. Instead of throwing money away into drywall, I am taking that money and I am investing into stocks, index funds, assets that don't leak when it rains. As a result, my money actually works for me instead of against me. So when people say renting is throwing money away, I just shut up and smile while I'm thinking, at least I'm not throwing money into a hole in a roof. You think owning a home is expensive? Hold on, because before you go ahead and fix leaky faucets and pay property taxes, there are some entry fees that you have to pay just to buy or sell the damn thing. For buyers, there are costs like down payment, there is inspection, there's insurance, there are moving costs. And for sellers, there is commission for the agents. There's capital taxes, there's property taxes, there's home repairs, closing costs. Those are all costs that you gotta pay. I always thought of it like you are paying cover for a club that you already own. No matter which side you're on, there's gonna be a money leech attached to it, and that money leech doesn't just suck. It drains. To make this more concrete, let's use an example. Let's use the example of a $400,000 house and show you how most home buyers and sellers are really just cash flow donors. So let's set this up. If you are selling a house that's $400,000, your realtor commission is gonna be around 5%, let's say $20,000. Your closing costs and fees is gonna be around $2,000 to $3,000. Home repairs and maintenance is gonna cost you, around $5,000 to $10,000. And mortgage payoff, let's say that you still owe around $320K. So you sell your $400K home and you pay off all the little expenses that's not so little, your mortgage, your $25 to $30K in fees. At the end of the day, you're gonna walk away with around $50 to $55K. And here's the kicker, that equity probably took you years to build. But the moment you sell it, a slice of it goes to everyone except you. And the buyer side is not any better. For a $400K home, a down payment of 20% is like $80,000. The home inspection is gonna be, let's say, $500. Closing costs, $8,000 to $10K. Moving expenses is gonna be $2,000 to $3,000. And new furniture or upgrades, which is always expensive, is gonna be $5,000 to $10K. So instead of needing just $80K for the down payment, it really costs between $80 to $104K in cash. So as a result, the American dream actually starts you off in the red. And you're actually not building wealth because you're starting off at a loss. Meanwhile, Zillow is bragging about a $400K sale, whereas the seller made about $50K and the buyer is out $60K before their first mortgage bill arrived. And on the other hand, the bankers, the real estate agents, the tax collectors, they all made money from the sale. Whether it goes up or down, they made money. They're laughing the way to the bank. And even worse, both the buyer and the seller believes that they're winning. They believe they won, when in reality, both of them have just been drained by the system. So ask yourself, when you're buying a home, are you really building wealth when most of your investment goes into interest, taxes, and fees? Because that's something that most people never question because they're raised by their parents telling them that the only way that you're gonna build and make money is by buying real estate. That is the only smart move. That is what kids grew up seeing their parents, their teachers, boomers on Facebook do. As a result, the entire generation ends up doing the same thing that keeps them trapped. Buying a home that makes everyone rich except them. Don't invest in stocks, you'll only lose money. That is what my mom used to say to me. And then she'd turn around and tell me to save money because that's the way you're gonna buy a home. Because real estate never fails. Turns out that's the biggest financial myth of our generation of millennials and Gen Zs. That's what I grew up hearing, that homes were the safest investment and that stocks were gambling. And that belief wasn't random. I really think that that belief came from experience because when my parents bought their home, it was the 90s, and during the 90s and the early 2000s, home prices just exploded. And my parents saw the rise in that. That was proof that real estate is the sure thing. However, they didn't realize that something else changed. The world was moving faster. It was going global. It was going digital. The market that used to crawl at a snail's pace is now sprinting as fast as a cheetah. If you look at the last 30 years, the numbers tell a story. From 1995 to 2025, real estate rose at 309%. That's a great return, isn't it? Yes, it is, but not that much when you compare it against the stock market. Because the S&P 500, which are 500 of the most valuable companies in the US, returned 1,008%, 3 times higher than what real estate returned. Let's put that in real numbers to make the example more concrete. Let's say John and Jane both had $100,000 to invest in 1995. John went ahead and bought a home in 1995 for $100,000. And Jane just invested everything into the S&P 500 index. Over those 30 years, John in 2025 would have a home that's worth $309,000, whereas Jane, with her investments into the S&P 500, would now have $1,008,000. To make things even worse, John likely doesn't even have that $309,000 because money had to go to closing costs, money had to go to real estate agents, money had to go to maintenance. Jane, on the other hand, she had none of those costs. All she had to do was click reinvest dividends, which means that she probably has even more money from that S&P 500 investment than $1,008,000. As a result, the story that we're told that homes build wealth doesn't hold up anymore. Not when flexibility itself is an investment. Still, most people choose to be like John instead of Jane. Most people throw money into their homes not knowing that it's actually keeping them poor. And that is because most people want something that they can touch, the paint, the bricks, the lawn, which also costs money to maintain, not knowing that if at some point you need money, there's an emergency and you need to sell, it's going to be much harder. It's not like a stock that can be sold to the market at any time with an order. You can sell pieces of a stock, but you can't just sell your kitchen from the house. It doesn't work like that. Because when it comes to stocks, you have a worldwide market that you can sell to, that you can buy from. Whereas when it comes to a home, you're only limited to the people within your zip code or the people moving into your neighborhood. Which means that stocks don't just outperform real estate financially, they outperform philosophically as well. They allow you to stay free, they allow you to stay flexible, they allow you to stay mobile. So maybe the American dream isn't about owning a home. Maybe it's about owning the ability to move whenever you want to. Maybe it's about the ability to grow your wealth without having to prove it with a white picket fence. You know, they say owning a home makes you more attractive. And I, for one, think it's true. Until they realize that getting to your home takes 1.5 hours to drive there. By then, the spark is gone. And so is your date. And this happened to a jiu-jitsu buddy of mine, actually. He was seeing this girl that lived 1.5 hours out of the city. So he would go and drive 1.5 hours outside of Dallas in order to see this girl. And that's one way. And I was joking with him. I'm like, dude, that's 3 hours round trip. Bro, that's not romance. That's a road trip. And I laughed and he agreed. And 3 weeks later, they broke up because the commute killed it. And that's the thing with millennials. We can't afford anything that's in the city because the prices in the city are sky high. We just can't afford it. The only thing that we can afford are those homes in the countryside. That's 1.5 hours away. And most millennials, because of what they heard from their parents, think that whatever home they buy, whether it's in the city or in the countryside, it's going to be a smart decision. They're making the right choice and becoming smart homeowners. However, for me, I think that is the single worst decision you can make as a millennial because it doesn't just keep you far away from Starbucks, it keeps you far away from people. And it would be a decision between my wife and I to move to the countryside because there's better peace and quiet for the kids and there's space for them to run around. And even then, that is a 2-person decision. It's not just a 1-person decision to make that move to the countryside. And I had friends, good friends in Alabama that did the same thing. Each of them owned their own home before moving together. At the end of the day, one of them had to sell in order for them to move in together. It's just so much work. However, many millennials move out there alone because they bought the idea. Why pay someone else's mortgage when you can pay for your own? If you're paying for rent, that's just throwing money into a dumpster fire. Owning is always better than renting. Turns out, those sayings don't help people swipe right on you. What happens is you just end up in a beautiful home. But the catch is, you're lonely, far away from anyone that you can build a life with. And it's ironic because the home that was supposed to give them stability actually keeps them isolated. You know, as a result, the single millennials that end up buying in the countryside end up in a 3-bedroom household with no partner, no family, no children, just cats and echoes. And hey, if that's the dream, if that's genuinely what you want, peace, quiet, isolation, cows for neighbors, then I say go for it. But if what you really want is connection, community, a life that moves, then maybe it's time to reflect on the old advice that you were given. Because while owning a home might make you look stable, if it's in the buttfuck middle of nowhere, it's gonna be a hard time finding someone that's willing to share it.